So our next speaker is going to be talking about architecture systems analysis approach for human Mars missions. So we have Dr. Patrick R. Chai. Patrick is the lead for NASA's Mars architecture team and leads the In-Space Transportation Assessment Team as part of the agency's ESDMD directorate. He's also co-lead of the campaign for ESDMD's Moon to Mars Architecture Development Office as well. So Patrick, are you...
Great, thank you. All right, good morning, everyone. Again, my name is Patrick Chai. I represent the ESDMD's Strategy and Architecture Office. Within that, we are the Mars architecture team. So we heard a lot of great conversation this week already. On the first day, we heard Spuds and Bhavya talk about the objectives themselves. Yesterday, we heard the AAs talk a little bit about the implementation of it. Here I'm going to talk a little bit more detail and what we at the architectural level is thinking about when it comes to these strategy and the actual architecting of these missions. So before we start, a little bit of history. When we think about architectures, especially Mars one, I mean, this is, we've been looking at Mars architecture for many decades now. A lot of these historical approaches really focused on sort of the elements, right? Werner von Braun started with the optimization of using the Apollo program's elements to see what we can do to send humans to Mars. There was a study in the 80s looking at, if we build ISS, can we use some of those elements to extend to Mars? The RA5 also had some, current elements. These are all kind of, very element and specific designed approach. I know the previous talk, just mentioned how these approaches can stovepipe and really are kind of implementation specific, and they don't succeed because they fundamentally don't have sort of the staying power across multiple administrations and multiple congressional budget cycles. So as we've been talking about for the past week here, there's a fundamental shift in how we approach these architecting and how we approach designing a Mars architecture. And that really starts with trying to answer 6 key questions. And this is very fundamental, right? We have a very difficult challenge. You wanna answer these questions: who, what, when, where, how, and why. And the important part here is not only do we need to answer these questions, the order in which we answer these questions have very significant impact on how the architecture is developed. We had a great panel yesterday talking about Mars 2033, right? That's answering the when question. But if you answer the when question first, that drives sort of the technology development timeline you have, what you can actually do in that time frame, and that really sets how the other questions, and you can box in some of the constraints on the other boxes. So it's one approach. In the past, thinking about the historical architectures, you focus a lot about the how to get there and back, right? The elements themselves. And if you set that one, it really has impact on the other area too. And so with the new architecture approach, we talk a lot this week about setting the why, right? The objectives, the Moon to Mars objective that the agency has released really sets the why, right? Science, inspiration, national posture. That is the foundation in which we are building the architectures, right? And we're architecting from the right. So we're answering the questions of why we're going and developing architecture, developing systems, developing concepts to achieve those objectives. So within the Strategy and Architecture Office, our job and what we're doing right now is decomposing those objectives into both characteristic and needs, and then use cases and functions that architecture needs to meet in order to satisfy these objectives. And science, I know, is a big pillar of it, and we are engaging with the scientific community. Within ESDMD, we have the Science, Technology, and Utilization Office, who interface directly with the Science Mission Directorate. The objectives themselves, the science objectives, are developed by SMD with consultation from the scientific community. There will be additional sort of interfaces with the scientific community to really help us define these scientific goals, because ultimately we can't decide, at the ESDMD what the science objective are. But at the same time, it is a balancing game, right? We can't achieve every objective at the same time. That's just not practical, right? So there is going to be some prioritization, understanding what we can do in what sequence, so that it makes sense, so that it's a more long duration exploration, right? So. High level, this is how we're approaching it. The QR code points you again to the Moon to Mars objective document. At the end, there will be a webpage on our actual ADD that was mentioned in previously. But with that stage set, I want to talk a little bit more about some of the key questions that we are trying to address within the Mars architecture team in terms of in these contexts. So. I'm going to show a video real quick. This is a representative, well, not representative, it's an example trajectory for a Mars mission. And one of the key things that we have to think about when we go to a Mars mission is that it's very different from a lunar mission, because we are in heliocentric space. So when we go to Mars, the planets move. So it's not like going to the moon, where the moon comes around every 28 days or so. The orbital dynamics of it really dictates that we have to follow celestial mechanics of physics. One thing I want to note, top right here, you will see some numbers ticking up. The odometer that we have to travel is pretty significant. It's the distances and then the round trip communication delays are all dramatically different than our current experience. This particular example trajectory is 850 days round trip. It's kind of in between your short 2-year class mission and then a long stay mission. Kind of bridges in the middle. It stays at Mars for about 50 sols or so. So that's kind of the minimum, like a floor in which we're trying to consider, for a mission at Mars. And you can see here the round trip communication delay, 43, 44 minutes. So, I think if you're sitting on Mars and listening to this YouTube stream, the program had just started when you receive this. So it's a little bit different perspective. And then you just saw here just now, there is also other consideration. We talked, there was a conversation yesterday about the solar conjunction. There will be communication delays and lags and also blackout periods. How do we plan for some of those things? The odometers right here, you can see here, as we're coming back to Earth, and we're chasing Earth back now and trying to rendezvous back with Earth, 1.8 billion kilometers distance travel on your odometer for your transportation system. It's considered the Artemis 1 mission that we just did. That was, I think, about 1.8 million kilometers round trip. So 1,000 times the distance of the Artemis 1 mission. And so that's sort of the setting the frame, right? You have to rethink the way we think about missions, because fundamentally it is a totally different thing and totally different beast. So the experiences we have, while great, has to be adapted. Going a little bit further, I think the top graphic here is showing the distance between Earth and Mars is great, and then we've seen a couple of versions of this, but the distance between the planet doesn't really tell that full story, right? Because you can't just go from point A to point B directly in heliocentric space. That's just not how that works. You have to follow celestial mechanic guidelines. So the actual distance traveled is, you can see right there, is the thing that really needs to be important, right? And the scale of it is completely different. So how do we plan for something that is fundamentally different than how we do business now and how we do space flight? Communication delay, how do you plan for a mission that has potential delays of 20 to 40 minutes round trip? Like, what does mission control right now at Houston? How do they operate in that framework, right? If there's blackout periods of weeks, how do they plan for those and provide enough information and autonomy to the crew that they can actually operate and safely and survive those periods, right? So, and the other thing too, you're so far away from Earth, you're not going to be able to have the resupply that our current missions really rely upon, right? How do you pack for a 2.5-year mission or 3-year mission? And how do you make those logistics, the foods, how do you make them last long enough that they are still going to be nutritious and provide enough energy for the crew towards the end of the mission? The how, and now this is something that we've always think when we think Mars architecting, this is what we really think about. Multiple options. Again, one of the key tenets of what we're trying to do here is understanding that the trade space is wide open. We are evaluating all the options. Because we have this objective-based approach now, we have to step back and think about different options so that we can see how each of the options measure up, how they fulfill the objective. So for both the crew and the cargo, we are looking at multiple options across the board. In looking at different ways to achieving the same goal and evaluating how they perform, especially with regards to the objectives themselves. Mission opportunity, the when question, and this is something that we've talked a lot about this week already. The energy required to go to Mars vary quite significantly across the Earth-Mars synodic cycle. The chart's really hard to read, but the y-axis is the energy. Yesterday, the 2033 discussion, they're talking about 2033 is a great opportunity. Yes, it is one of the easier ones, but there are other easier ones, and there are other opportunities that can also be designed to fulfill a lot of the different objectives, right? The ultimate question we have is, do we want to design for a very, very, really easy mission? And if you miss that mission, you end up not being able to go for another 15 years? Or do you design a system that is robust enough that can bridge across a majority of these missions so you have the flexibility to be able to handle schedule slip so that you're not tied to that specific opportunity? So the when is a very complicated question to address. And the other consideration for the when is the round trip duration, right? The example from the video is 850 days, about 2.5 years, right? One of the key questions that we're trying to address, and I'll get to it here in a couple of slides on the crew side, is how long can the crew stay alive and be healthy for a round trip duration, right? Our current experience in the international station is about a 1-year mission, right? And we don't have a lot of data beyond that. So we would need to be able to get some experience for the longer duration space flight, understanding how the human physiological behavior is past that threshold. The other thing too is we don't really have a lot of experience of how the crew behave after long duration in space life, going back to the surface, needing to immediately do activities, right? So that's something that we can test at the moon to help us do a little bit of analoging to understand how human behavior and physiology behaves, so that we can design proper systems so that we can support the crew when they actually eventually go to Mars. And once they get to Mars, there's also other questions, right? Where do we go on the surface? And this is going to be very much informed by our scientific objectives, right? We want to go somewhere in which science is key, right? We want to go where the scientists tell us this is where we want to go. We're going to get the most out of our science objectives. But there are other considerations. Planetary protection is a big one, right? Accessibility from the system. Now, if you want to go to the poles, for example, that that's a pretty significant challenge to the transportation system. So that, that is going to be putting a lot of burden on the transportation system to get you to the pole. But can you have a little trade-off? Can a high latitude be sufficient to achieve the scientific objective, right? These are all the considerations. And what do you do on the surface? There's a lot of things we can do. Is it a mobile habitat? Is it a fixed habitat? These are all the questions that we're trying to lay out the trade space so that we can understand how they all perform with respect to the objectives. And the power, of course, is a key aspect. We understand dust storms is a pretty significant impact on solar panels and solar array power generation. So do we need a efficient surface power on the surface? An ESDMD is developing efficient surface power for the moon. How can we learn from those experiences and leverage those investments so that we can have a really good, robust power system on the surface of Mars to support crew activity? And finally, the who, right? Who do we send? How many crew do we send to Mars? And these are very fundamental questions that impacts across the architecture, right? Is it 4? Is it 6? Is it 8? How many do we land? Do we leave a few crew in orbit and only send a couple onto the surface? Kind of like Apollo. Apollo had 3 astronauts, only 2 went to the surface, 1 stayed in orbit. Do we do something similar? Do we send everybody to the surface and leave the transportation stage completely autonomous? These are fundamental questions that need to be answered. And answering these questions require a lot of analysis and a lot of coordination across the board. We're working with our Human Research Program Office and the Human Health Office to help us understand what are the challenges, what are the constraints. And then the crew complement side of thing, it really is going to be dependent on the design of the system. How many crew do we need to operate and maintain the spacecraft for the long duration that we're planning for, right? That's not something that we can just decide on our own. It needs to be informed by sound engineering decisions and an analysis to inform those decisions. And so, summary slide here. My boss here in the back, Michelle Ruckards. This is her animation. And Mars architecture and mission planning is like a balloon animal, right? The who, what, when, where, how, and why. Those questions need to be answered, but each of them impacts another, right? You can't just say, I want to push all the burden on one versus all the burden on another, because all you're doing is squeezing the balloon animal and pushing the problem somewhere else, right? So it has to be a very much even keel and compromised approach across the board to build a robust architecture. There are a lot of key things that we can learn from the moon to help us inform some of these decisions. But there are really fundamental differences between how we plan for the moon and how we go into Mars too. So those considerations need to be taken into account when we design these missions. And again, the crew is fundamental. The last talk about crew safety is paramount, and that is the fundamental tenet that we have, right? And within the Moon to Mars objective document, that is a recurring tenet, right? Return crew safely to Earth. That is fundamental, and we have to consider that above all else. So, if you're interested in learning more about the architecture, the Moon to Mars architecture definition document, ESDMD 001 is the document number, is out in public now. In the website, you can see there. It's very, very easy, nasa.gov/Moon to Mars architecture. On top of that, we have published several white papers. The transportation one is one of the white papers that we've published, and that goes into a lot more detail on the approach we're taking. And so there are a lot of opportunities both for industry and for public to engage. There's an email address that's attached to the webpage that you can submit comments. I know there is plan for an industry workshop that is, I think, happening at the end of June to solicit inputs from industry. And fundamentally, I harp back to the 3 pillars of the exploration, right? Science, we are engaging with the scientific community to help us understand what the objectives are and how what are the requirements to help us understand what we need to do on the surface of both Moon and Mars to help achieve those scientific objectives. The national posture, really is focused on our industry, building up the capability, advancing the technology, advancing the manufacturing capability across the board to help us as a nation, and training up the people, the skilled workers that we need to help us for these long duration missions. I know there's a discussion this afternoon about skilled workers across the aerospace industry. And then finally, inspiration. This is the fundamental, and this is where this group and this organization and the students here in this audience is fundamental for what we do, right? Inspiration is key. Science is great, and I know the talk just now talked about, science is why we go, and I don't disagree with that, but if you can't inspire the public about what we're doing and explain to them clearly what those scientific objectives, what we're doing on the moon and Mars is actually doing for them, and inspire them to do great things, we likely won't get a lot of support across the board. And so I leave you with this image. This is a fun artist rendition of what it'd be like to be, taking your kids out on first day of school on the surface of Mars, as sort of a last inspiration image. So thank you for that.